It was a Tuesday afternoon in a small town in Ohio, and Linda's front door was standing wide open. Not because she forgot to lock it, because back then nobody did. Children ran barefoot across 3 lawns without anyone calling the police. Neighbors knew each other's names, their birthdays, and the sound of their car pulling into the driveway. It wasn't the size of the house that made America feel rich. It was the people inside it. Tonight, we're stepping back into an America that valued a full table over a full closet. And by the end of this story, you'll understand the one habit that quietly held it all together. If stories like this speak to you, stay close, hit subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Because the biggest lesson of this story hasn't even started yet. Homes built for living, not showing off. Susan's house in 1958 had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a kitchen just big enough for one woman to turn around in without bumping the stove. Nobody in her neighborhood had a walk-in closet. Nobody needed one. The living room held a couch, 2 chairs, and a radio cabinet that doubled as a family altar every evening, its wooden knobs worn smooth from years of small hands turning the dial. There was no clutter because there was nothing extra to clutter with. Furniture was chosen because it would last 20 years, not because it matched a color scheme copied from a magazine. Susan's kitchen table had 1 wobbly leg that Robert had shimmed with a folded matchbook years earlier, and nobody had ever thought to replace the table because of it. Curtains were sewn from leftover fabric, hemmed by hand, and hung the same week the house was bought, still hanging a decade later, faded but familiar. The modern struggle looks different today. Closets overflow with clothes worn once. Garages hold boxes nobody remembers packing. Digital carts fill up at midnight with things that felt necessary for exactly 4 minutes, only to arrive in a box that gets pushed unopened into a corner. The vintage solution was almost embarrassingly simple. Susan owned what she used, and she used what she owned, and every object in her home had earned its place through years of daily service rather than a single impulsive purchase. Picture her on a Saturday morning, apron tied at her waist, wiping down the same wooden table her mother once wiped down, taking pride not in what the house contained, but in how clean and cared for it looked from corner to corner. That pride was not vanity. It was ownership of a smaller, steadier life, one where nothing sat forgotten in a drawer because there simply wasn't room for forgotten things. Here is the modern translation worth trying this week. Before buying anything new, ask whether it earns a permanent place in your home, or whether it will simply join the pile of things waiting to be minimized later. Susan's house was humble, but it never once felt empty. And what happened next door would test whether humble could also mean strong. Neighbors who felt like family. One October evening, Susan ran out of flour halfway through a pie crust, and instead of driving to a store, she walked next door to Patricia's kitchen, still wiping her hands on her apron as she knocked. Patricia handed her a cup of flour without a second thought, the same way Susan had handed over sugar the week before and eggs the month before that. Nobody kept score. It wasn't charity, it was rhythm, an unspoken agreement that ran quietly beneath the entire street. When Barbara caught the flu that winter, 3 women took turns bringing dinner to her family's door, no questions asked, no thanks required, each dish arriving still warm in a towel-wrapped dish that would be quietly returned, washed, and refilled the following week. When Deborah's husband was between jobs for 6 weeks, nobody spoke of it outside the neighborhood, but somehow their porch always had a basket of vegetables on it by Friday morning, left there before sunrise so no one would feel the weight of being watched.
This wasn't organized charity. It was an invisible insurance system built entirely on trust, and it required no forms, no applications, and no proof of need beyond a neighbor simply noticing. Children moved freely between houses, too, and it wasn't unusual for Tommy to eat dinner at Patricia's table on a Tuesday and for her own son to eat at Susan's on a Thursday, with neither mother thinking twice about where her child had wandered off to that afternoon. The modern struggle is loneliness disguised as convenience. We can order groceries without speaking to a single human being, and something in us quietly starves from that ease, even as our doorsteps fill up with packages and our phones fill up with notifications. The vintage solution cost nothing but time and attention. A phone call, a shared casserole dish, a porch light left on so a friend would know she was welcome to knock, even at 9 in the evening, even without calling first. The modern translation is simple. Pick one neighbor, one old friend, one family member, and reach out this week with something small and useful, not because you need anything back, but because that is exactly how trust used to be built. One small favor at a time, one open door at a time. And favors, it turned out, were only half the story of how children grew up strong in that world.
Susan's son, Tommy, left the house after breakfast most Saturdays and didn't return until the streetlights flickered on, and nobody worried because half the mothers on the block were watching from their kitchen windows without ever saying so out loud. He walked to school along the same cracked sidewalk every single day, rain or shine, past Deborah's house, past the corner store where the owner knew his name and occasionally slipped him a piece of hard candy for being polite, past the empty lot where every boy on the street had, at one time or another, built a fort out of scrap wood and old crates. Toys were rarely bought, they were built. A wagon made from spare wood and salvaged wheels, a slingshot cut from a forked branch and a strip of old rubber, a doll sewn from scraps too small for anything else, its yarn hair braided by hand on a rainy afternoon. Responsibility came early and quietly. By age 8, Tommy carried in firewood without being asked twice, stacking it neatly by the stove the way his father had shown him once and never needed to show him again. By age 10, he understood the difference between a want and a need better than most adults understand it today, because he had watched his mother make that distinction out loud at the kitchen table more times than he could count. Skinned knees were treated with iodine and a hug, not a phone call to another parent. A missed dinner bell meant a scolding, not a search party. The modern struggle is a childhood scheduled down to the minute, supervised constantly, ferried from one structured activity to the next, yet somehow more anxious than ever, more uncertain of its own capabilities than any generation before it. The vintage solution allowed boredom to exist, and inside that boredom, creativity and independence quietly grew, unmeasured and unmonitored, exactly the way they were meant to. The modern translation isn't about letting a child roam unsupervised streets that no longer exist the same way. It's about giving them small, real responsibilities today, a chore with no reward attached, an errand that requires trust, a little unstructured time with nothing but their own imagination to fill it. Because the confidence Tommy built walking to school alone would follow him for the rest of his life, and it began at a dinner table his family never once ate without him. Families ate together every night. At 6 o'clock sharp, Susan's kitchen table became the center of the entire household, and there was no version of the evening where a phone rang and interrupted it, because there was no phone at the table to begin with, only the clink of forks and the low hum of the radio finishing its evening program in the other room. Her husband, Robert, came home,
washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat in the same chair he'd sat in for 15 years, the one with the slightly worn armrest where his elbow always rested. Tommy talked about school, about a spelling test or a schoolyard argument settled at recess, and Susan listened while passing the potatoes, asking one more question just to keep him talking a little longer. It wasn't glamorous, it was simply consistent, night after night, year after year, whether the day had been easy or hard. Sunday dinners were slightly larger, slightly slower, and always included whichever relative happened to be nearby that week. An aunt passing through, a grandfather with a story he'd told a dozen times before, but told again anyway because everyone still wanted to hear it. Traditions weren't written down anywhere. They simply repeated until they became sacred without anyone declaring them so. The same grace said before the meal, the same chair left open for whoever might still arrive. The modern struggle is a family eating in 4 different rooms at 4 different times, staring at 4 different screens, technically together under one roof, but emotionally scattered across the internet, each person narrating their day to strangers online before ever mentioning it to the person seated 3 feet away. The vintage solution required almost no money and almost no effort beyond simply showing up and sitting down, plate in hand, attention undivided. The modern translation is not about banning every phone forever. It's about choosing one meal a day, even 15 minutes, where the table becomes sacred again, where a question gets asked and actually answered, where a child learns that someone is listening without distraction and without a screen glowing between them. That single habit, repeated for years, built more emotional security than any amount of money ever could, and it quietly prepared every person at that table for the harder lessons life would eventually ask of them. And it turned out the strength built at that table would be tested by something Susan never expected to fix with her own 2 hands.
People fix things instead of replacing them. Susan's Sunday dress had a tear along the hem, and instead of tossing it into the trash, she sat by lamplight after Tommy went to bed, needle and thread in hand, mending it stitch by careful stitch until it looked nearly new again, the small lamp casting a warm circle of light over her lap, while the rest of the house slept quietly around her. The weight of her cast-iron skillet sat heavy and familiar in her hand, passed down from her own mother, seasoned by a decade of Sunday breakfasts, never once replaced because it never once failed her, its dark surface holding the memory of every meal it had ever cooked. When the toaster stopped working, Robert didn't throw it away. He opened the back panel at the kitchen table, found the loose wire with a small screwdriver, and fixed it himself, while Tommy watched and learned, without realizing he was being taught anything at all, simply absorbing the quiet confidence of a man who assumed things could be repaired before assuming they needed to be replaced. Socks were darned instead of discarded. Chair legs were re-glued instead of thrown to the curb, and a coat with a worn elbow got a leather patch instead of a trip to the store. This wasn't about being poor, it was about being capable, and capability itself became a kind of quiet wealth that no bank account could measure. The modern struggle is a culture where broken means disposable, where a phone with a cracked screen gets replaced instead of repaired, where fast fashion fills landfills faster than closets can empty them, and where the skill of mending has quietly disappeared from most households in a single generation. The vintage solution treated skill as a form of savings, every mended sock and repaired chair quietly protecting the family budget without a single dollar changing hands, and every repair completed by hand was one less trip to a store, one less bill added to the pile. The modern translation doesn't require sewing your own dresses from scratch. It means learning one repair skill this year, hemming a pair of pants, patching a small hole, tightening a wobbly chair leg, and treating replacement as the last option rather than the first instinct. Because the money Susan saved through skill alone was about to matter more than she realized, especially once she opened the envelope she kept hidden in the back of her dresser drawer.
Simple joys cost almost nothing. On warm evenings, Susan and Robert sat on their front porch with 2 glasses of iced tea, the ice long melted by the time the conversation slowed, watching Tommy chase fireflies across the yard, while Deborah's family did the same 3 houses down, their laughter carrying easily across the quiet street. Sundays brought church socials where every woman brought 1 dish, and somehow the table always overflowed with more food than anyone could finish. Casseroles and pies lined up end to end on a folding table someone had set up before sunrise. The county fair came once a year, and it was talked about for months beforehand and remembered for months afterward, a single dollar buying an entire evening of cotton candy and carnival lights, the smell of fried dough and cut grass hanging in the warm air long after the rides had gone quiet. Backyard barbecues needed nothing more than a grill, a few burgers, and whichever neighbors happened to wander over when they smelled the smoke drifting across the fence line, folding chairs pulled from garages and arranged in a loose circle that grew larger as the evening went on. None of it required a vacation fund or a credit card, a reservation or an admission ticket. The modern struggle is a joy that has become expensive by default, an outing that isn't complete without a purchase, an evening that isn't validated until it's posted online for others to see and measured against everyone else's highlight reel. The vintage solution proved that connection, not consumption, was the actual source of happiness all along, that a porch and 2 chairs could hold more contentment than an amusement park ever could. The modern translation is choosing 1 free or nearly free gathering this month, a porch evening with a neighbor, a potluck with old friends, a walk at sunset with no destination and no cost, and noticing how full that simple evening can still feel, even now, even in a world built to convince us otherwise. Because as rich as those small joys were, something was quietly beginning to shift underneath all of it, and by the next decade, that shift would change everything.
What changed? Here is the reveal worth waiting for. As the decades rolled forward, houses grew bigger and conversation grew smaller. Families moved into homes with 3 times the square footage Susan ever had, extra bedrooms for guests who rarely visited, and formal dining rooms that sat unused most of the year, yet somehow date dinner together far less often than she ever had in her tiny 2-bedroom kitchen. Technology filled every silence that neighbors and porches used to fill instead, a glowing screen replacing the glowing porch light, a notification replacing a knock at the door. Doors that once stood open now stayed locked out of habit rather than necessity, and children who once wandered 3 blocks alone now needed a scheduled playdate and a signed permission slip to do the same. Ledgers built on trust were replaced by credit scores built on algorithms that had never met the people they were judging. Mended dresses were replaced by fast fashion destined for a landfill within a year, worn a handful of times before being discarded for whatever came next. Front porches emptied out as backyards filled with unused pools and untouched patio furniture, purchased with enthusiasm and abandoned within a single summer. More was acquired, and somehow less was felt, and nobody could quite explain why a bigger house had come to feel emptier than a smaller one ever did. This is the real discovery hiding underneath every envelope, every ledger, every handshake deal from that era. The goal was never simply spending less money. The goal was defining enough, and then living peacefully inside that definition, without constantly measuring it against a neighbor's newer car or a stranger's vacation photos. Susan's family didn't feel poor in that small house with one bathroom because nobody around them was chasing more, and there was no invisible scoreboard telling them they were falling behind. Today's modern struggle is a scoreboard that never stops updating, a comparison that never ends, a feeling of not enough that follows people into houses far larger than anything Susan ever imagined living in. The vintage solution wasn't smaller homes for the sake of being smaller. It was contentment, chosen on purpose, defended fiercely, and passed down at that same dinner table where the biggest lesson of all was quietly being taught the entire time. The ending, comment, question, and soft CTA. The past wasn't perfect, and nobody watching this pretends it was. There were hardships that history sometimes forgets to mention, and comforts we rightly enjoy today that Susan never had access to. Conveniences that make modern life genuinely easier in real and meaningful ways. But somewhere between her small kitchen table and our oversized dining rooms, something quiet slipped away, and it's worth bringing back on purpose rather than mourning by accident. Maybe the America we missed wasn't built with bigger houses. Maybe it was built with smaller homes, stronger families, and more honest hearts. The kind of household where an open door meant safety instead of risk, where a shared cup of flour meant more than any amount of money ever could, and where a mended dress was worn with just as much pride as a brand new one. Susan kept that envelope in her dresser drawer for 40 years, not because of what was inside it, but because of what it represented. A family that knew exactly what enough looked like, and never once went looking for more than that. Content to let the porch light, the shared table, and the mended clothes tell the real story of their wealth. Do you think families today would save more and feel more content if they returned to using cash for everyday spending the way Susan did at that kitchen table? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you of your own grandmother's kitchen, your own childhood porch, or a lesson you want to pass down to your own children, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Leave a like if it moved you even a little, and share it with the one person who needs to hear it today. Because the wisdom in these old kitchens was never really lost, it was just waiting for someone to come looking for it again. The past wasn't perfect, and nobody watching this pretends it was. There were hardships that history sometimes forgets to mention, and comforts we rightly enjoy today that Susan never had access to. Conveniences that make modern life genuinely easier in real and meaningful ways. But somewhere between her small kitchen table and our oversized dining rooms, something quiet slipped away, and it's worth bringing back on purpose rather than mourning by accident. Maybe the America we miss wasn't built with bigger houses. Maybe it was built with smaller homes, stronger families, and more honest hearts. The kind of household where an open door meant safety instead of risk, where a shared cup of flour meant more than any amount of money ever could, and where a mended dress was worn with just as much pride as a brand new one. Susan kept that envelope in her dresser drawer for 40 years, not because of what was inside it, but because of what it represented. A family that knew exactly what enough looked like, and never once went looking for more than that. Content to let the porch light, the shared table, and the mended clothes tell the real story of their wealth. Do you think families today would save more and feel more content if they returned to using cash for everyday spending the way Susan did at that kitchen table? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you of your own grandmother's kitchen, your own childhood porch, or a lesson you want to pass down to your own children, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Leave a like if it moved you even a little, and share it with the one person who needs to hear it today. because the wisdom in these old kitchens was never really lost. It was just waiting for someone to come looking for it again.